last talk on this track, and today, so future-proofing API security by Chuck Herrin from WAIB. Are you there, Chuck? Yes. Great. You look so secure, like standing like that.
That's the plan. That's the plan.
Okay. That's the plan, to make us feel secure. Okay, so your slides are up and we are ready to go. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much, Mindrik. It's great to be here. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone from Dallas, Texas. Hope everybody's having a great day. I'm going to carry the theme forward of talking about API security, and many of the stats and data points that Levin just presented. I agree with completely. It's a big issue, and we're going to talk about how to get ahead of it and stay ahead of it. I also want to talk about a few other pieces. As the audience members to this chat and people who are going to be watching this video later on YouTube and so forth, you can sort of think of yourselves as ambassadors or on the leading edge of coming back to your companies and talking to your CISOs or your heads of development, your CIOs, whoever you're going to be discussing this with. So I want to give a little bit of background about not just that API security is different, but I want to talk about why API security is different, how it's different, so that we can really understand and dig into a little bit of the differences between the traditional approaches to OWASP type web application security. There is some overlap. There's a Venn diagram with some overlap between the old list from 2003 and the new list from 2019. How, as a defender, so I've been the CISO of publicly traded financial institutions based in the US and in Bermuda for the last 18 years. Most recently, before joining WIB as the CTO, I built a digital bank. And what I learned doing that was A, API security is really hard, and B, API security is really immature. And so what I like about meeting with the folks at WIB based in Tel Aviv is the comprehensiveness and the completeness of the approach and the vision. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then we're going to talk about how to address API security, what to do, how to get in front of it, how to stay ahead of it. So I think every good update should have three pieces: what, so what, and now what. And that's what we're going to do today. And I'm going to leave a couple of minutes for some questions at the end as well. So let me crack on. Why is API security different? So basically the architecture is different, which makes the attack surface different. When we all started moving from monolithic to microservice-based architectures, that changes the attack surface. I know some of the other sessions have discussed this, so I'm not going to belabor the point too much. But essentially, when you change the architecture, you change the attack surface, and therefore the attackers have new ways and different ways to attack the logic that you're surfacing. APIs by design surface attack application logic directly. That's not a bug, that's a feature. What that means is that traditional defenses like WAFs, API gateways, they really struggle to understand the context of what's supposed to be provided and what's not. And even within particular endpoints and APIs, there's often a challenge of really understanding what the design spec was supposed to do. And so if you look back at the Facebook and Cambridge Analytica issue, that wasn't really a hack, right? The company surfaced an API that happened to allow downloading hundreds of millions of records. Somebody took advantage of it. They didn't crack an encryption key, or they didn't exploit a buffer overflow or SQL injection issue. They took advantage of the logic that was offered in an unexpected way. And that's the way that these attacks vary. These attacks are different. So basically, the logic-based attacks that we're going to talk a little bit more about in a second are really about making unexpected requests and exploiting failures to scope, authorize, authenticate properly, and so forth. And it's just kind of a different animal. And therefore, the defenses need to be different. The traditional rule-based systems like WAFs really aren't built for this. They don't understand the application logic. They can't understand the application logic. However, a lot of CISOs and even engineers, they think, okay, well, APIs speak HTTP, web application firewalls speak HTTP. I bought a layer 7 solution. I'm probably covered. And it turns out that they aren't. And all of these factors combine to make APIs the #1 attack vector in 2021. So in 2019, Gartner first said that APIs were going to be the #1 attack vector by 2022. And then in 2021, they actually revised that and came back and said, we actually undershot that a little bit. It's already #1. The big caveat that I like to add to that is as a CISO, those are the attacks that we've detected. And the more that we work with, government agencies, customers across the world, finance, banking, healthcare, insurance, the amount of API traffic that is currently unmonitored is pretty staggering. So if it's already the #1 attack vector with all the blind spots, it's pretty chilling to think about how bad it actually could be once you uncover all the visibility gaps. So what are the analysts in the industry saying? API security is clearly a focal point. That's why we're here today. That's what we're talking about. Gartner's API best practices, we're going to talk about a holistic solution, a holistic approach, but it goes beyond just monitoring your traffic and seeing what goes across the wire, because you have vulnerabilities potentially with zombie APIs, zombie endpoints, and we think that at WIB that it's really important to dig into your code base and hook to your repos to determine endpoints and APIs that your code may be calling outside your organization that don't go through your API gateway if you have one. They may go over some other channel via TLS and you can't see into that traffic. So you really have to address it from multiple angles all at the same time to get your head around it. And if you think that you maybe feel like behind the curve, you're not. This is happening in real time. So Gartner just modified the reference architecture to include API security as a dedicated layer just a couple of months ago. This is a rapidly evolving space. And unfortunately, as attackers learn, how much value they can extract from APIs, it's only going to increase. And so this is what we're seeing in the wild, right? So the point of this slide is not the FUD, right? Look at all these. This could happen to you. And we specifically chose these companies because these are well-funded, mature security organizations that wound up just having a bug, just having a defect. And it led to some pretty serious issues. So why do current defensive approaches fall short? Fundamentally, the main reason is we're fighting the last war. And as defenders, we're almost always fighting the last war. So take this outside of the computing space. Back at the beginning of what was going to be called the Great War and then became World War I, we saw armies in Europe and skilled professional soldiers riding into battle to defend their homelands on horseback with brightly colored uniforms and sabers running into columns of machine gun fire. They were ready for the last war. They weren't ready for the new one. At the end of the Great War, the best military minds in Europe, Maginot, Joffre, and others, came together and built what was known as the Maginot Line. And this was a series of fortifications and defenses all the way from Belgium, all the way down to the Mediterranean, 10 to 20 kilometers deep in some areas, with turrets and bunkers and underground tunnels and supply chains and water cisterns and things like that, specifically so they wouldn't be caught off guard the next go around, the next time that they had a conflict. And just 10 years later, an attacking army came through and went around it. And then with the advances in air power, the Luftwaffe flew right overhead. There were no anti-aircraft capabilities of the Maginot Line. Defenders are always fighting the last war, always. That's just human history. But when we go back into the technology space, we see that this, history doesn't always repeat, but it definitely rhymes. We see this rhyme throughout history. Technologies advance, and if you're going to stay in business or you're going to stay ahead of, ahead of the bad guys or ahead of your competitors, you have to adopt the new technology or you get left behind. The 1914 example, the world didn't mechanize. The Industrial Revolution and mechanization technology didn't move forward so that we could create machine guns. But armies that did not have machine guns could not compete on the battlefield. So everything becomes a technological arms race, whether we're talking about computing power or, the Iron Age versus the Bronze Age versus, arrows versus, bullets. All throughout human history, we've seen the same pattern. Now the attacks are just digital. Technology's advanced to the point where it's not only in the kinetic world that we have to worry about these things, but also in the digital. Attackers always take advantage of new capabilities, and defenders have to scramble to urgently keep up. So the key takeaway here is to get ahead of this and to stay ahead of this. One thing that we say at WIB a lot is your defense must be informed by the offense. If we were still in 2011, we'd be worried about DDoS attacks more than we are today, right? So I was on Wall Street as the CISO. We got hit by a group that was totally not officially sanctioned by the government of Iran, but companies that were striking out at American business interests. And DDoS caused a lot of damage. It caused a lot of outages. As attackers change their tactics, we worry less about today. Our defenses are much better now. However, DDoS is still a concern. Several major government agencies in Israel were knocked offline via DDoS attack just earlier this week. So as the attacks change, it doesn't mean we have to stop worrying about the old ones. We have to worry about those as well. But as new ones evolve, we have to be on our toes and make sure that we're keeping up with it, so we're not always fighting the last war. Some more modern examples. If you've got some gray in your beard or gray in the temples, been around as long as I have, you may remember the days of mainframe computing, right? Dumb terminals, green screens. I was there, and having been a CISO of several financial institutions, they're still there. They're still running. But when we started adopting client server and distributed computing, the top secret, IBM Z series, RACF type security, that doesn't work in the client server model, right? Then now you need client side antivirus, and you need all kinds of different things that you didn't have to have in the old model. Security model lagged behind. I remember the first set of desktops that we ever rolled out at one of the banks where I got my start in security. Everybody was a local admin, and we didn't know any better at the time. That was the only way we could get stuff to work. And then we go to the internet. Going to cloud, we've all been, we've all seen the security model lag behind when companies start to adopt the cloud. I and a colleague wrote the cloud operating guidelines for a Fortune 5 insurance company where I was head of IT security risk and compliance for everything consumer facing back in 2011. And we had a business need that on-premises computing simply couldn't match, so we had to adopt it. We had to do it for stress testing. Under the regulatory regime that we were under at the time, but the security model lagged behind. We had to figure it out on the fly. In 2001, the Agile Manifesto was first written, and less than 15 years later, more than 50% of companies describe themselves as Agile. And I'm sure that a lot of folks in this audience would enjoy a beverage conversation about whether companies are really Agile or not, or what do they think Agile means. But that evolution in how we create and release software has also made a material change in the way that we secure it, because the old waterfall practices where you have some manual pen test or something at the end of a quarterly release cycle doesn't work anymore when you're releasing every 2 weeks. You can't add a 3-week manual pen test to a 2-week sprint. And now the latest example, the one that we're talking about today, is around microservices and the shift from monolithic to microservice-based architectures. And we're seeing now many, many advantages to adoption. The adoption is inevitable. Safe adoption is not inevitable. And so it's really important that we get and stay ahead of this, because the attack surface is changing and it will continue to do so. And regulators are pushing for this change because they are demanding that companies, especially in finance and healthcare and insurance, are surfacing more data to help with competitiveness and customer choice. So the regulators are demanding more access to this data via APIs, and companies and government agencies are going to need to know how to do that in a secure way so that they can keep their eye on the ball. So here, let's talk about the differences between the OWASP top 10 and the OWASP API top 10. And unfortunately, the animation for this slide didn't translate when I uploaded it. But I'm just going to focus on the top line here for a second. The OWASP API top 10, or the OWASP top 10, came out in 2003, and we've all been monitoring that for a long time. And it goes from number 4 to number 2, year over year, number 6 to number 3. But in 2019, for the first time, OWASP released an API top 10, and primarily the difference here is that the OWASP API top 10 are mostly issues with logic-based attacks, mostly. There's some Venn diagram overlap for things like injection. We still see header-based attacks, but most of the OWASP top 10 that we've been using and contributing to and refining over the last 19 years, these are mostly rule-based attacks, and the defenses to counter them, like WAFs and API gateways, are rule-based systems. And they simply lack the context of the ability to defend against logic-based attacks. They can't do it. And so a recent white paper from a security researcher based out of Las Vegas, great paper, and love her work. She tested 50 banking apps, and 50 out of 50 were vulnerable to the first issue here, API number 1, BOLA. We see it very, very commonly. Now, how do we detect these things? How do we address these things? You have to do it with the full life cycle. So let's talk about how we actually discover attacks in the wild. In the US, we use a security model called NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology. It maps really easily to other models like ISO. But at the foundation of the security model is identify, close your blind spots. Identification, you can't manage or defend assets that you can't see. You can't protect assets that you don't know about. And we see consistent, under visualization from security operations teams, development teams, IT teams. They don't know all of the endpoints that they have in their environment, and they don't know all the APIs that they're consuming, not only hosting and surfacing, but consuming themselves. And that's why we really think that you have to get a good view inside your code base to understand what your code is surfacing internally, as well as what you're consuming to the outside. So if you have sensitive data going to Salesforce or HubSpot or something similar, you may not know that just looking through your API gateway or your traffic, monitoring your traffic. And it's really important to get that holistic view all the way from the code to production. And then from the production side, we run attack simulations that actually take your endpoints. We'll take your Postman documentation or whatever specs you have, and we will simulate attacks, basically fuzzing the logic and looking for these logic-based attacks. And the attacks spider out like tree roots to see what logic-based vulnerabilities are out there that your developers never anticipated. So it's really important that you shift left as much as you can, because fundamentally these are logic issues and you have to fix the code, but you also have to shield to the right. And as a CISO, I need to know first and foremost, what am I vulnerable to the outside? So it's not enough just to monitor your traffic. You have to monitor your traffic. That's a key part of it. But you also have to simulate attacks to the outside so that you really understand what your vulnerabilities are and what can be exploited in the wild. This approach is really critical to getting your whole arms around this problem. And going back to the code base on the left-hand side, shifting left, we talk to a lot of our customers whose developers update their APIs multiple times per week, sometimes even multiple times per day. And one of our co-founders, Dr. Tal Steinhertz, was the CTO for the Israeli Cybersecurity Directorate. He served there for 27 years, and he calls it insecurity by design. It's simply not possible to manually test multiple releases of code every single day. That has to be automated. You have to get back all the way into your code base. And then from a CISO's perspective, I have to know what am I actually vulnerable to the outside every single time that code base changes, which is where our attack simulator comes in. The traffic inspection underlying all of that is really critical as well, but you have to bracket all of these things in a 360-degree approach to really solve for this problem. So some key takeaways, and then I'm going to finish right on time, maybe 1 minute early. Key takeaways. APIs expose application logic directly. That changes your attack surface. It's novel. It means that attackers can do novel things that they were never able to do before in a monolithic application, monolithic apps. Pretty mature, fairly easy to secure. Many organizations aren't one or the other, they're both. And so your security program has to take that into account. Your defense has to be informed by the offense, and your architecture dictates what your attack surface looks like. Microservices offer a number of advantages, and the adoption is inevitable. Safe adoption, however, is not inevitable. And unfortunately, even in industries where regulators are mandating the increased usage of APIs and data sharing, companies have no recourse just because a regulator told you to do something. If you do it insecurely, you can't go back and say, well, the regulator made me do it. That's not going to fly. So the regulatory mandates are only providing a tailwind for increased adoption of APIs and microservices for key business processes, making the security challenge that much harder. Traditional web application approaches were designed for monolithic apps. They're still there, they still exist, they're still valid. We still see SQL injection, we still see cross-site scripting, and like these are still valid attack vectors, but it's not the sum total of attacks the way that, it's not as comprehensive as it was 10 years ago. Much like the Maginot Line was very effective against ground-based defenses. It didn't do anything for air-based attacks. And so in the web application and the API security space, essentially, we can't just focus on that anymore. We have to look up. That was my timer. And API security requires a holistic approach to provide broad visibility all the way from code to production. You can't protect what you don't know that you have. And so finding your blind spots is really critical. I've only said in joking for the last 18 years that sometimes CISO stands for career is suddenly over. And whenever that happens, it's generally a blind spot. It's never something that you knew about. It's never something that was in your risk register that you wrote down and you made your business leader sign off and say that you accept the risk for this vulnerability. It's always something that it was an unknown. So getting your arms around your visibility is absolutely foundational. And let me pause there and take any questions that the audience may have. Thanks very much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Okay, I'm looking at the audience here, looking at your eyes. Do you have any questions? Nothing in the chat so far, but thank you for the great talk. And I'm not sure if I should say like, let's have world peace or let's have API peace or something, because there were so many threat scenarios in the talk. But I hope that, like, I agree that there are a lot of issues out there and a lot of things that are exposed even by the OWASP top 10 list. That should be very clear. But I think that I have to ask, by the way, I think the new API top 10 list was published in 2019, but there has been an API top 10 list before that. But I think it was specifically for REST APIs. So does that new list kind of cover other APIs than REST?
Yeah, it does. And we're seeing as companies continue to adopt new technologies like GraphQL, that's going to change the landscape as well, right? So whatever your developers are building or whatever software you're buying or consuming, same principle. That's going to change your attack surface, which means that's going to change what's available, and you have to stay abreast of that and make sure that you're defending against those types of attacks as well. This is really why dedicated API security companies like ours exist. It's kind of like especially like pen testers or incident responders. I think everybody in the security field and everybody in development should have a solid foundation in this, but somebody has to do this full time because it changes so rapidly. And that's where firms like ours, this is what we do. We live and breathe this stuff. And so that's, it's more than a full-time job, especially for CISOs that have, things that they have to worry about.
I know. So there's one question in the chat, actually, a little bit broad maybe to cover in this time, but if you're talking about like smart cities or specifically IoT or even operational technology APIs, like basically stuff that is not traditional IT. So how do you see this security and API security with those?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's unfortunately, it's something that, as we've seen the Internet of Things over the last several years and how security lags so dramatically there when you buy your web-connected toothbrush and your web-connected light bulbs and all of those things, and typically they're not upgradable or they're not easily upgradable. It's a real concern, especially when we get into smart cities and things like managing traffic patterns and red lights and green lights, and you have life safety issues. And so it's not only building security into it and thinking of all the abuse cases, which is what we hit with our attack simulation to really figure out what you're actually vulnerable to. But once you do find something that you're vulnerable to, how easy is it to upgrade those distributed systems? There are a number of home-based devices and cheap little trinkets that come to people's houses and they plug into the internet that essentially you can't upgrade. There's no interface. There's no way to even if the manufacturer finds vulnerabilities, they're out there and they're not upgraded or upgradable. I think that's as big a concern as building security in initially. You're always going to miss something. So then what? Once you miss something, how do you address it once it's already out in the wild?
Yeah, I think that I love the way that Volvo API manager said some years ago, the Swedish car manufacturer, that when they build APIs in the cars, they have to think about decades of upgrade and no upgrades and still being up to date enough and being secure, and if you have something in a building and a part of a building, you can't just go ahead and switch it without ripping apart something in the building. Great. Thank you for that. Yeah. Just
every avenue they make available to do the upgrades is another avenue for potential attack, right? So
exactly.
It's a tough challenge, but hey, this is what we do.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Chuck, for having this talk. And now